Quick disclaimer. The following episode is recorded prior to May 12th, 2026, which is before North Carolina lawmakers agreed to create a budget framework with raises for teachers, law enforcement, and other state employees. What if I told you that the classroom that your child sits in right now, the teacher standing at the front of it, and the resources that the school has or doesn't have are a direct result of who we voted for?
Welcome, 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 welcome. You're listening to Built by Us.
Built by us.
Built by Us.
Built by us.
On May 1st, hundreds of thousands of teachers, parents, and organizers and advocates ignited a march across North Carolina to let their voices be heard. North Carolina used to be a state that invested in its teachers and its schools. As recently as 2008, we ranked 25th in the country for teacher pay. As of May 1st, we ranked 43rd. In the years between then and May 1st, the North Carolina General Assembly made decisions one session at a time that dismantled the financial case for teaching in North Carolina. And last month, the courts officially closed part of the door on holding them accountable. Now, we didn't get it overnight, and that has been a snowball of attacks when it comes to the detriment of public education since the mid 90s. To help me understand this, I've asked the vice president of the NCAE to come on our podcast. Thanks for joining us, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kai. It's a pleasure to be here.
If you could tell us more about the NCAE for people who are not familiar with your work, why was the NCAE founded and how was it founded?
Sure. So, the North Carolina Association of Educators is the shorthand is our union for our public school staff here in North Carolina. And its origin is in two different teachers associations that were started back in the 1800s, shortly after the inception of public schools in North Carolina. There was a white organization, the North Carolina Education Association, and a black organization, the North Carolina Teachers Association. And like happened all over the country, these associations emerged as a way for people to advocate for the profession, advocate for public schools, try to win better working and learning conditions for our kids. The what becomes NCAE is a merger of those two organizations on the backside of the defeat of Jim Crow. So in 1970, affiliates NEA, so NEA, which is the parent union, the National Education Association, NEA affiliates all throughout the South had to make decisions about what to do with two separate teachers associations. So in 1970, there was a merger of the black and the white organization to create the NCAE. And what still is really important about our story and part of the legacy of NCAE is that when that merger happened, as I'm sure you know some part of the story, Kai, of when integration happened in lots of institutions in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, was black organizations, black individuals were just subsumed into existing white organizations in ways that were, filled with cultural loss, lots of job losses, etc. Well, the leadership of the NCTA at the time argued that there should be if an actual merger would be the creation of a new organization. So instead of NCTA being subsumed into NCEA, it became the NCAE as not just a symbolic move, but as a way of actually saying these two organizations have now ended to create a brand new organization rather than just one becoming the other. So this legacy of racial justice, racial parity, racial solidarity is baked into the core of what NCAE is in our state.
Thank you so much for giving us that background, Brian. Both of my grandparents were educators who were a part of the integration of schools and did most of their schooling and most of their teaching and end up retiring educators all in Cumberland County. And the work that NCAE is doing is truly, I was speaking to my grandmother about it, is truly moving. And also, as she was telling me, is almost every teacher should be out there with you guys when she was watching the rallies on May 1st. When we start to think about the rally that you guys led on May 1st, could you tell us going into that rally and even now what is the current narrative around public schools, and what is not true about the story of public education, and um, where is all this information coming from around what is going on in public schools in the narrative?
Sure. Well, I think what feels important to name is that there are multiple truths at the center of what is actually happening in public schools these days. So, the truth that we don't talk about is all of the miraculous things that are happening in our school, right? Like it is by far the most successful public institution in the history of our country, right? Kids come to us, they can't read, they can't do math, they don't have any context for building community or relationships with other people. They don't know about their bodies. They definitely don't know physics or calculus or United States history, right? And then 13 years later, right, they come out, many of them speaking multiple languages, the ability to read, write, do math, build community, etc. Right, and so one of the things that I think is a really important thing for the supporters of public schools to do is to talk about every day what are the incredible successes that we have, right? Because even in the most under resourced, the most in transition public school that you could walk into in this state, you could walk into classrooms and find really incredible things happening and kids being met and nurtured and supported in growing into their fullest potential. So that just feels like an important thing to start off with, and a thing that far too long, the supporters of public schools have been shy about talking about how important the successes are, right? So that just feels like the first thing to name. But I think from there, the dominant story, right, the dominant narrative around public schools that's really been around since the 1980s is that public schools are failing, right? Now, we got to understand the origin of that, right? So shortly after Ronald Reagan was elected, as someone who was elected, and backed by right wing corporate elites, right? Who the goal in his administration was to shift as many resources as possible back to the wealthiest Americans. And in doing so, cut taxes and thus cut all kinds of programs. That was sort of the vision that the people who put Reagan into office had. And so it's really, really difficult to dismantle a public institution that is one that people understand as successful, right? And so they had to do an incredible communications job of making up a story about the failing public schools. So I think it's around about 1983, a couple of years into his first administration, Reagan's Secretary of Education publishes a report called "A Nation at Risk." Now, I'm not a scholar, right? And so I can't do the work of poking holes in the scholarship that is in that document, but others have done that work for me. So it's not a very impressive document with respect to its veracity, its scholarship. But what it began was the story of the failing public school, the failing public school, the failing public school, right? So you get further on into the 80s and 90s, and that message, the right has so successfully put that message into the mainstream that you start walking up to people on a street corner and say, "Hey, how are the public schools doing?" "Oh, I hear they're terrible," right? And then you see movies like Lean on Me, right? Where they're showing you these images of like, these really stereotypical, almost like the opening shots of Lean on Me look like a zoo, right? And the way that they portray our kids as animals, as out of control. So this story of the failing public school becomes a centerpiece of the strategy of the folks who want to dismantle public schools, which makes sense. You have to convince people that something isn't working in order to convince them that you should defund that thing, right? And you have to do that because our mothers and grandmothers went to public schools and taught in them, and we went to them too. So there had to be some kind of thing that interrupted what our experiences were. Now, the thing that's complicated, and this is why I say there's multiple truths that we have to incorporate here, is that there is truth in the fact that public schools have failed to live up to their promise to meet the needs of every student in the same way, right? So the experiences of Black and brown students, the experiences of students with disabilities, the experiences of poor students, right, have never, just like the rest of America, right? This isn't unique to public schools. Their experiences have never lived up to what the promise of public schools were supposed to be. And that's part of where the people who want to dismantle public schools have been very successful, because they've gone to those communities and they said the schools are failing your kids, right? And there is some element of truth to that. But what they aren't saying is that those schools are failing, the schools are failing those kids because of their policy and budget decisions that are taking the resources out of those schools or never put them in those schools in the first place. Right. So the story of the failing public school, right? One doesn't match what the experience is, doesn't tell the whole story of what's happening in our schools every day. And while it does in some ways speak to the experiences of significant segments of students in public schools, it doesn't put the credit, right, or the blame where it ought to be with respect to why that is the case. So when we talk about the dominant narrative about public schools, or any narrative about public schools, we have to consider the source and the motivation of that source. So, are we asking a parent whose kid has had really, really terrible experiences because they have a disability and there aren't enough resources there for the school to take care of them? Or are we talking to someone who went to private school, who was going to send their kid to private school, who sends their kid to private school on a voucher, and has a vested interest in telling the story about a failing public school? So when we talk about that narrative, the important thing is really to consider the source and to think critically about what that source's motivations are.
When I start to think about the narrative too, Brian, I even think about older films, specifically you said in the '80s. I think about the George McKenna story in Hard Lessons, where Denzel goes in there and the school again is like this horrible place, and it's also repeated often throughout medias, is you have these teachers who come in and try to make these places better, but I think what those movies fail to point out is the thing that you pointed out, which is what is actually making these schools worse is the policy decisions that affect their budgeting, that affect, how much teachers can be paid, how much money is spent per, student, and I think the closest you'll probably see is maybe in something like Coach Carter, where you kinda see in the conditions around the school that the environment isn't, conducive to helping this place that is the pinnacle of the community, and it isn't until the community comes together that they're able to make the school and even the basketball team this amazing, this really amazing place.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think what is noteworthy, right, is that in each of these films that you talked about, right, like one, there's always this like individual savior, right? So, it became a joke in the 90s because it became this, white lady who comes in, right, in Dangerous Minds, or whatever the later version of that was with Hilary Swank, right? Um,
Freedom that's Freedom Riders, yes.
Right. So we're seeing these individual heroism of Morgan Freeman's Joe Clark character, or Michelle Pfeiffer in a cool leather jacket, right? So we point to these individual things, but there's another part of the story that we really have to pay attention to, which is the way that we have told a story that public schools are somehow supposed to fix economic inequality throughout our entire society, right? And there is a thing that is a very, very powerful story that is in many ways correct and has its origin point in the Black freedom movement, where once African American communities started to get access to better schools, that opens up more opportunity. But opportunity doesn't mean that all of a sudden there are a whole bunch of really good jobs in the economy. It just means more people can compete for the terrible jobs that exist in the economy that they were locked out of before. So there's also part of the story of public schools that's really problematic, where we say, well, the future to a good economy is a good public school. The future to a good economy is good jobs. The future to a good economy is affordable housing and healthcare, right? Public schools, if 100% of our kids got 4.0s, there aren't enough seats for them in college, right? Well, let's just say there were, and they went to college and they all did exactly as we told them and they studied their best and they all got 4.0s. They go into an economy that has like 70 or 80% low wage jobs. And that has nothing to do with the public school system. That has to do with how our economy is structured. So I think there's another really important part of what we need when we look at those Hollywood stories, right? Is that there is this implication that if this school was better, then somehow every single problem that those students faced would go away, right? Rather than saying that the schools, just like every other part of our society, are part of a system that doesn't guarantee that people are going to have their basics needs met, right? And so while the public schools do some work to mitigate the cruelty of that world that we live in, they can't eliminate that cruelty, right? And so I think that's another important part of the story that we have to talk about.
The public education is just a piece of the pie in which, um, when it comes to getting people their needs and also creating economic growth and creating just a well-rounded democracy that people can flourish in. But it's only a piece of the pie, and it's not the whole pie. When I was looking or when I was watching the rally on May 1st, I pondered upon this question of when did some of this start? How did we get to this point? I grew up going K through even K through my undergraduate, all in public education, and I felt like my teachers were paid well. I felt like, from what I could see, they adequately lived well, and that my schools were funded. And I started to do some research, and then I found out that in 1994, 5 low wealth counties sued the state of North Carolina in what is now known Leandro versus the state of North Carolina. And me living in one of those and going to school in one of um, those 5 being Cumberland, Hoke, Halifax, Robeson, and Vance. Um, Me unknowingly going to school K through 12 in Cumberland County, I knew nothing about this case, and I actually didn't know until later, until really now, that my education had been underfunded. If you could track us back to 1994, Brian, and what were they arguing? What were some of the early findings? And what did the courts actually decide? And who is or what is Leandro?
Um, yeah, so I want to affirm, what you're saying, Kai, about like the experience, right? When I moved to North Carolina, my father was in the military. When I moved to North Carolina in '95, I moved to a public school system in Craven County where I had excellent teachers. And part of the story, part of the narrative about North Carolina was its strong public schools, right? So much so that when I went to get a job in the public school system in 2004 in Wake County, I was working in a moving company 2 weeks into the school year because people wanted to work in North Carolina public schools, right? Now we've got over 6,700 teaching vacancies in the state. And that's just in my career. That's literally just in the last 22 years of me being an adult and working in public schools. The transformation has been that profound, right? So the Leandro case that you alluded to, which again happens while I'm in high school. This is how this all of this is in the course of my lifetime, right? So I'm in high school in 1994 when the case is brought. And the case is brought um, because the way that funding works in North Carolina is that the overwhelming proportion of the funding for public schools comes from the state, right? And that's actually constitutionally mandated. There are ways in which states around the country have their policies differently, where school boards have the ability to raise taxes themselves, right? But how it works here in North Carolina is that the overwhelming amount of money is supposed to come from the state. And that's constitutionally mandated. This goes back to the Reconstruction Constitution of the 1860s. This is the first demand that newly freed Black people in the South made all over the South, was wanting to have public education provided for all, written, codified into state law. So that happened here, right? And so that's the precedent where in the 1990s, those 5 counties that you named said the state isn't meeting its constitutional obligation, right? Because even though we're taxing our residents at the same percentage as other counties, because we don't have the same tax base, our kids are getting an inferior experience. So their assertion in the case, right? Rob Leandro, he's a 8th or 9th grader at the time, and is kind of one of the named defendants. But like you said, it's a joint case from these 5 counties. They're saying that our kids, that the state is violating the Constitution with respect to our kids. In 1997, court says that's correct, right? And the state owes here, right? Now, doesn't happen, and doesn't happen. Again, in 2004, the case is actually even broadened, right? And it's like, and they name specifically, if you don't have a high quality teacher in every classroom, a highly trained administrator, enough resources, etc. So then it becomes an understanding that it's not just these 5 counties. There's actually all throughout the state. This is endemic at this point in 2004. Well, continues to be no funding, right? Continues to be no, other than the court saying that state must do this, there isn't any initiative that's taken by the legislature, right? Which is where that funding should come from. When you get to 2017, after Governor Cooper is inaugurated, right, he rekindles an interest in Leandro case, and they bring in an independent consulting group called the West Ed team, and they made a series of recommendations that said if the state over the next 8 years spent an additional, I think it's $6.8 billion, they could remedy, right, what is going on here and work towards the kind of state that is fulfilling its constitutional obligation and meeting the needs of our kids. So that report was issued, right? But again, there's no teeth because the law in North Carolina has the legislature as the site of the funding. Well, our state legislature, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a little bit, since 2011, has been deeply committed to unfunding public schools and taking resources away from public schools. So that legislature took no action on those recommendations. And then finally in 2022, another judge demanded that the legislature release those funds, right? Saying the state courts have said this, state courts, their job is to interpret the law. Legislative policies should follow. The legislature has not followed these policies. We demand they begin releasing this payment and making remediation now. Well, a couple months later, there's an election, and the majority on the Supreme Court shifts, and they halt the case. And then just a few months ago, they heard the case. They heard the case again last year, and then just a few months ago made their decision that essentially on jurisdictional grounds threw the case out and said that they would not be enforcing the decision that the judge had made in 2022. So at this point, the Leandro court case is no longer in the system. Yet the constitutional obligations are also no longer being met. So we're in the same situation that we found ourselves in.
Moving from the Leandro case to 2004 and even some of 2011, what could be almost starting to be defined as the decline of public schools. What are some of the other things and some of the policy actions that took place from maybe 2004 up until now, after Leandro is really defined in 1994, that really start to make our public schools decline?
Sure, sure. So, a lot of people point to 2011 as kind of the origin point of a lot of this, and I think that's an important point. But I want to actually back up a little bit further, um, because I think there's a more complicated version of the story that we have to tell, right? Because when the court decision is made in 1997, we have Democratic majorities in both houses, and we have Democratic governors for most of the next period. So Democratic lawmakers were also not meeting the requirements of the Leandro decision in a way that feels important to name. And it also feels important to name that just as what happened in the rest of the country, when the Great Recession hit us in the late aughts, um, our state's Democratic legislature and Democratic governor froze our pay, right? And furloughed us, right? So just like what happened in the rest of the country, instead of the wealthy people who put us in the situation of the Great Recession having to pay for that, right? That got pushed down onto working class people. And in particular, I know that it was either 4 years or 5 years in a row where my check was the same exact amount every single month, which, as you know, in an economy where there's inflation, right, that amounts to a pay cut every single month. So for 4 or 5 years, even prior to the right wing takeover of our legislature, we were already beginning to see some of that disinvestment play out. Now, the story of the beginning of the active dismantling, right, in a different kind of way, begins when North Carolina is helps to elect the first Black president in 2008. And what we saw was all around the country, corporate right wing money looked at North Carolina and said, that state is going to help elect a Black president. No, 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 no. We've got to invest our resources there. So, kind of riding the wave of the racist Tea Party backlash that was happening all over the country in response to Obamacare, and just the reality of the breaking of the glass ceiling and having a Black president in the country. What you saw was this infusion of resources that helped to shift balances, helped to shift the balance of power in legislatures in 2010. That happened all over the country. We were no anomaly there. So in 2011, right, when the new Republican majority takes over in the General Assembly, it is a new Republican majority, right? Whereas the previous 20 or 30 years, North Carolina's public schools had been well funded by this bipartisan consensus, where you had kind of business-minded Democrats, and Republicans who were relatively moderate, and they resourced public schools, K-12 and the university system in our state. Those Republicans either stopped existing in our state, starting with the legislature in 2011, or they just got real quiet. Because what happened under the leadership of Phil Berger in the Senate and Tom Tillis in the House was an immediate shift to the right. Right. So what we're seeing right now, for example, in the ways that states are responding to the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, that happened in North Carolina in 2011, right? These racist gerrymanders that they put in place to lock themselves in power, those cases went all the way to the US Supreme Court multiple times, right? Because essentially what that new legislative leadership was committed to was, instead of having voters pick them, they were going to pick their voters. And so you saw shifts where the majority of North Carolinians were voting for Democrats to send to the US Congress, but our US congressional delegation was like 10-4 Republican, or like 11-3 Republican, right? Because they had drawn the lines in such a way that locked them into power. So they did the same thing in the state legislature. So as soon as you get to 2011, I can't, Kai, it happened so fast. I can't remember which one was which year, but starting in 2011 and then deepening in 2013, when they had super majorities in both houses and the governor. So there was literally no barriers to what it was that they wanted to do. What we saw was cutting of like 7,000 teaching assistants, right? And just the North Carolina Public Schools before that had a commitment to teaching assistants in every classroom K-3. So immediately, straight out
Yeah,
of the gate,
I don't think I've seen a teaching assistant since I was in pre-K and kindergarten.
yeah, gone, just
After
gone.
after first af after fir after, and that oh, and then I think I had one in 3rd grade, and she was actually, no, take that back. She was a student doing her teaching hours, like, she was,
Right.
like, a senior,
Yep.
and do you know that semester where they have to get so many hours
Yep.
for their teaching, I think it's teaching practicum, and then for the
Yep.
certification, we had her, in Mr. Johnson's class.
Yeah.
And then after that, I've never seen a teaching assistant,
No, see, there's no way. In fact, Phil Berger called them obsolete, like typewriters, right? And discrediting people's professionalism, right? So TAs gone. Salaries were going to be cut, and any growth in salaries was going to happen in the first 5 years of the profession, essentially creating a situation where people could come in, afford to be a teacher for 3, 4, 5 years, and then leave. Well, if you talk to anybody who's been a teacher, you start learning how to tie your shoes at about year 4, right? This is dealing with the complex challenges of 20, 25, 30, 35, 40 kids in your classroom at once is something that experience really helps with. So you began to see this bleeding of the teaching workforce in North Carolina of veterans, because their people could not economically sustain it, right? We went from having healthcare that was a 90-10 copay split, right, that we got for free. We now pay for a 70-30 split. We had some of the best due process protections in the country. Those were eliminated. So you just go down the line, right? And in every single part of the profession, from administrators to classroom teachers to TAs to resources for kids, they dismantled the Teaching Fellows program, which was incredibly successful at recruiting people into the classroom who would then stay. They eliminated master's pay, right? So they just about every single part of the playbook that really you're seeing currently in the Trump administration, right, was piloted here in North Carolina starting in the early teens, right? And the whiplash has been so profound, right, that you go from a state where, like I said, when I entered the profession in 2004, we were near the national average in teacher salary, right? We're now in 46th in the country, right? We were near the national average in terms of per pupil expenditure. We're now 50th in the country, right? And this is not a long period of time that this is happening. So these results happened uh, rapidly and decisively starting in 2011 with the election of the leadership that currently is still in power in the North Carolina General Assembly 15 years later because of how successfully they've managed to suppress democracy.
It's funny you bring up the it's not I wouldn't say it's not funny, but it's very ironic you bring up the Teaching Fellows Program, Brian, because it was the program that all my teachers, again, very similar to the teaching assistants. I had some teachers who had been through teaching fellows that end up being my teachers who would brag about the program and say how good it is as a resource for if you are trying to pay for school or are interested in the profession. You could talk to them about teaching fellows and how that, eventually just kinda faded away in conversation. I remember in my I don't remember in my later years having that kind of pitch for teaching fellows, and it did bring about a lot of the teachers that literally stood in front of me for K through 12. When we start to look at that decline to and it brings us to where we are now, recently on April 2nd, the North Carolina Supreme Court dismissed the Leandro case in a 4-3 decision. Um, in North Carolina's top rule court, they cannot compel the legislature to spend money on education. So what did that 4-3 decision mean for the Leandro case and kind of education in the state of North Carolina as a whole?
So one, it means that our state is in violation of its own constitution, and the Supreme Court, whose job it is to interpret state laws, right, is in violation of the most important law that governs our state outside of the U.S. Constitution, right? And and doing so, what they are doing is dismantling a process that like I said, the origin of that constitutional mandate is the 1860s and Reconstruction and the demands of newly freed Black people. But like any racial justice demand, right? Millions and millions, tens of millions of white North Carolinians, right, have benefited because of that constitutional mandate, right? So when we see these racial justice wins, like getting this into the Constitution in the 1860s, what we see is that everyone benefits from that, right? And so one thing that the throwing out of the Leandro decision means is that there's a whole bunch of kids who aren't going to get to benefit from this incredibly unique and powerful part of our state constitution. So first, we have to recognize that. I think what it means for going forward, however, is one of two things, right? First is that what it means is that we now need to change through elections the composition of the state Supreme Court because this court is, like I said, in violation of its own state constitution by throwing the Leandro decision out. But it is also the court that is maintaining the gerrymandered lines that keep uh, the politicians who are in power in our state in the power that they have, which is illegitimate if you were to be looking at who actually votes in our state and who they actually vote for. And so, one thing that it means is that if we are going to get back to the funding in the legislature, which is where the funding will come from that our students need and deserve, is that we are going to have to win elections to change the composition of that legislature. To change the composition of the legislature, it means we're probably going to have to win a majority on the state Supreme Court in order to be able to get fair election lines and to limit some of the dismantling of voting rights that have happened in our state over the last 15 years. So that's one part of what needs to happen from here in order to get to the funding that our kids deserve now that we can't count on the courts to do their job. But the other thing that it means, and I think this is an important part, you alluded earlier to the May 1st demonstration that we had, is we need to have a different kind of public conversation in our state about what kind of state we want to be, right? So the people who are the powerful elites, right? The corporate backed right wing elites that rule our state right now, they want us to believe that our state is divided. People in this state are divided by white and black, or immigrants and, native born, or rural and urban, or Eastern barbecue or Western barbecue, right? There's all these different ways that you can divide up who lives in our state in ways that really hide who we really are as a people. For us, with the Kids Over Corporations campaign, we want to ask a different question. We want to go to every single part of our state and say, okay, given the choice between having a legislature that puts resources and funding behind the futures of our kids, or a legislature that puts resources, as many resources as possible, into the hands of the wealthiest people in our state, what would you choose? We feel real confident that across all those lines I just named, North Carolinians again and again and again, we've seen it in poll data that ask the question in different ways. We see it anecdotally all over the place, right? That if you ask North Carolinians this question, they are going to say, we support getting resources to the futures for our kids. So in addition to doing the organizing work and the work on elections in order to shift the balance of the state Supreme Court to then be able to shift the balance of the General Assembly, there's also just a path towards the General Assembly that we need by framing politics differently in our state and saying, are you one of the people that's for our kids? Or are you one of the people that's for corporations, right? Because the other thing that this state legislature has done for the last 15 years is shift as many resources as possible into the hands of the wealthy, right? They've done this through slashing personal income tax rates. They've done this through slashing corporate income tax rates. So right now, the corporate income tax is slated to be 0% by the time we get to 2030, right? What that's done is that has significantly limited the amount of resources that come into state government. So all of a sudden, the state government says, oh, goodness, we don't have any money. We have to start making cuts, right? As though they didn't create the conditions for those cuts in the first place. So for us, there's a very, very, very clear opportunity to raise the revenue that we need to double the investment that we're making in our kids up to a place where it needs to be if we begin taxing wealthy people in the state again, if we begin taxing corporations in the state again, if we end the voucher program, which is also just another tax giveaway for wealthy people, because at this point, something like 80% of the people who receive it were people who were already sending their kids to private schools and could already afford it in the first place. So all that is a tax break for people who already have more resources. And so the resources exist in order to be able to fund our schools, but we need to build a political movement and we need to build a public conversation that asks the right question. Not how do white people feel about this or black people feel about this, but which side are you on? Are you in this together? Are you for our kids, right? Or are you every man for himself? Are you with the corporations and greed? And we feel really, really confident that across any lines you draw in this state, that if you ask people, the overwhelming majority of people in the state are going to answer that question. I'm with the kids. I'm in this together.
I think a big word you pointed out right there, Brian, is investment. Like, what are we investing in our schools? What are we investing in our kids? And more importantly, like, what are we investing in the future? Um, And even when you pointed to the tax breaks, it reminded me of our previous episode we did with Budget and Tax Center, where we broke down the people's budget because obviously with the state budget, with us not having a state budget, it directly affects all of us, but especially our education system and teachers, because any of the proposed budgets would allow for any pay increases, or a pay increase in general, and that is mandated by the legislature. Another thing I wanted to ask you is if we are in the violation of our own constitution, where are these checks and balances that are a part of democracy, and why aren't the checks and balances working?
I mean, I think really, if you haven't, Kai, I would recommend to you and to all of the folks listening to this podcast to check out Nancy McLean's Democracy in Chains. She does a really excellent job in that book of laying out what are the ideas behind the movement that we are facing and currently losing to from our state level all the way up to our country, and the vision for our country that the folks in that movement have, right? And that movement, the movement that is really built around the idea that government should only exist to fund military and police and facilitate as much wealth goes to the wealthiest people as possible. That movement originates in the 1950s, right? In response to Brown versus the board. So public schools are at the center, right, of a movement that is ultimately committed to not just dismantling public schools, but dismantling public schools is a key component of a movement that is really about how do we eliminate democracy, right? Because the people behind this movement actually do not believe in a democratic society. They believe in a society that is ruled by a small handful of wealthy elites who believe that they know what is good for the rest of us. When actually, what it is that they are doing on a regular basis is just taking more resources from working class people and poor people and moving them up as much as they can in our society. So there's an incredibly powerful movement that is massively funded, right? When the Supreme Court decided its Citizens United case and unlimited resources could now go into elections, and you could hide where it came from, right? That opened the door for people like the Koch brothers and all these other incredibly wealthy elites to start funding and make real breakthroughs in a movement whose aim is to eliminate democracy.
Thank you so much, Brian, for tying that together. Um, and tying how democracy again, we talk about this all the time, within our organizations, intersectional democracy and how democracy touches on so many other issues. It's not just the voting at the polls, is who you're voting for and how that vote shows up in your community and the decisions that legislators make on your behalf. And by eliminating public education, um, it does take a big toll on democracy. How do you see the fight against publication? You kind of alluded to it earlier with the Voting Rights Act and what we're seeing now, and the gerrymandering we've seen over the past year. How does public education fit into this democracy model? And I think you've kind of already pointed out what's at stake is losing democracy. Um, but if you could, for one more time for our guests, how does it all fit together?
I mean, I think one of the things that is, it's one of those like you don't know what you got till it's gone phenomenon. It's really difficult to describe to people what the what the elimination of public schools as a public institution would mean, right? Going back to the very, very beginning of the call, and what are the miraculous accomplishments, right, in public policy that we can point to that public schools are a result of, right? And how even just the existence of a public institution like public schools is anathema, is at odds with the vision that these right wing corporate, elites have, and frankly, at this point, authoritarians have for the vision for our future, right? So any public institution, they want it gone. They don't want public housing. They don't want public health care. They don't want public transportation. They don't want welfare, social security, right? Because their vision of the world is every man for himself, right? And each of those public institutions that I name, they reinforce a very different ethic of how we are going to be, which is in this together, right? And so the danger, if we lose public schools, right? First, we lose the one place in our society where we come together across race. It doesn't exist in any other part of our society, right? And so, what I know about my own childhood and growing up in public schools, either on military bases or in military towns that were relatively diverse, what it meant was when I started hearing, later in my childhood, kind of the stories that are meant to indoctrinate young white kids and how race and racism works, someone would say, some example of a stereotype, and I could look at my friends TJ and Brooke and be like, they're not like that. I don't know what you mean, right? So because I had access to real relationships across race, you couldn't lie to me about race. You couldn't tell me racist lies in the same way because I had that context for relationship. If we don't grow up in having any ability to be in relationship to each other in our society, then the lies that racists tell us about each other, we're going to believe them and we're going to listen to them, right? So the possibility of having multiracial harmony, multiracial anything that approximates multiracial democracy becomes impossible in that context, right? And ultimately, yes, there is a profit motive, right? Because there isn't right now you can't make there's no ability to make profit off of public schools, but their real goal is about the battle of ideas. And their idea is every man for himself, dog eat dog, you just scrap it out, right? Social Darwinism, right? The survival of the fittest. The vision put forward by all the public institutions that I just named before, and the vision of multiracial democracy is that we are in this together, right? And if we continue to allow public schools to be dismantled, then we lose the main place where our kids are learning how to be in this together, how to have relationships with each other, how to navigate conflict, how to build community, right? All of those things are prerequisites for the kind of democracy that we're talking about. And so sometimes I think that progressives kind of miss how dangerous the moment that we are in is, right? Because if we continue to watch public schools be dismantled, we are in danger of losing the public sector, just in general. We are in danger of losing any possibility of cross racial solidarity. And we're in danger of succumbing to this every man for himself market logic, right? And so, even something as simple as saying to a parent, yes, you should be able to choose where your kid goes to school, right? Sounds innocuous enough. And I understand the motivation of it for lots of parents out there. But on its own, it is already buying into the logic, right? That some schools are good and some schools are bad. And we should get the choice, right, to where we get to send our schools based on some market logic. And the schools that are bad will just disappear. Well, that doesn't create a stable society. We've seen in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina happened, they dismantled the public school system and now is 100% charter schools in the city. Well, what that has meant is that the city's schools have been subject to the really inconsistent forces of the market, right? So you have schools that open up and close in the same year. Well, what happens to those kids? They get shuffled around from school to school. And what we know as people who study education, who understand the development of human beings, intellectually, socially, spiritually, physically, is that kids need stability, right? The market does not lead to stability. The market leads to volatility, to things happening, moving fast. We shouldn't have our kids' futures be subject to the instability of of the market, right? Of this survival of the fittest vision that these folks have. So I think that it is among the most critical questions that we need to be answering as a society right now, uh, because if we continue to allow our public schools to be dismantled, right, it's a slow boil with the frog in it, right? Just 1 degree at a time, and then all of a sudden you have found yourselves in an authoritarian society where we are completely divided by race, and where the outcomes, the opportunities that the majority of people have are significantly diminished, compared to the small number of people who are able to hoard their resources.
Brian, I had a very similar experience to what you had with knowing classmates of different races and from different economic backgrounds. In middle school and high school, I went to two schools of choice in Cumberland County for after my uh after my elementary school, and it was in those experiences that I was able to meet so many people from different walks of life. It has defeated all of my typical ideas of what most people would accept to be a stereotype about individuals, and that is from all different types of all different walks of life, from people with different faith backgrounds and different racial and ethnic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds to people from different economic statuses. It was in those experiences of having those people in my class that have really they've level set me to a point to where I know a lot of things are not said to be true. And I think you pointed out a really big thing here that we see across, um, that is probably at the heart of democracy, um, and sometimes can get the best of democracy is the battle of ideas, and that's what we're really battling about. The ideas in practice, um, and when we start to talk about that battle and people who may want to get involved in NCAE's work in a battle, and get into the battle with kids over corporations, how can they get involved with NCAE's work and what you guys are doing out in the community? What is the best way for them to get involved?
Sure. Well, immediately in this legislative session, there's a bill in the Senate right now, called the Kids Over Corporations Act, that has been relegated to the Rules Committee, which is usually where bills go to die. But that bill that we introduced the week before the demonstration would bring North Carolina's corporate income tax rate back up to 5%, which would still make it be lower than any other surrounding state, but would immediately create the possibility for hundreds of millions of dollars to be funneled into our public schools. So this legislature has a bill in front of it right now, has the ability to pass a budget, right? That could reverse all of the things that we're talking about, right? And so the first way that people can be active is through engaging, not just as individual, yes, as individuals, right? Make phone calls, send emails, do lobbying visits yourself, right? But get people together in your community, right? Go see your legislator in Raleigh, 5 or 10 deep. Wait till a Friday or a weekend and make an appointment and try to have a conversation with someone back in your community, right? Because there are actions that this legislature can take right now. I think the second thing that people can do past that, and this is just, any individual, right? I'll get in a second, I'll say what people who work in schools can do, but any individual, right, can do work between now and November to support pro public school candidates, through door knocking, through phone banking, through raising money, through talking to coworkers and community members and family and friends about, these are the people who are standing with our kids. These are the people who are in this together, right? And these are the people who are standing with corporations, and these are the people who are for the dog eat dog vision of the world. So that's a second thing. I think people who, and a third thing that people who don't work in public schools can do is, that's that narrative that we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, Kai, right? Like people talk about schools, right? So when people talk about schools, be somebody who enters into that conversation to challenge this narrative that is being uh, um, uh, perpetuated by people who don't have the best interests of our kids in the first place. So someone comes to you and says, "Oh, the public schools are failing." Ask them when the last time they went into a public school was, right? Ask them, have they visited their local elementary school and watched someone who didn't know how to read at the beginning of the year who now knows how to read, right? Ask them if they've seen that process. Ask them if they have talked to public school educators about what our conditions are, and not just teachers, right? Talk to bus drivers, talk to cafeteria workers, talk to front office staff, because each of these people plays a critical role in this community, that builds up the potential, and the possibility for our kids, and makes those potentials realities. So enter into the debate about ideas, right? Enter into the conversation about public schools. If you're someone who is, who has a kid in public school, right? Instead of shopping around and saying, what's the best school for my kid? Say, what's the school that my kid is assigned to? And how can I be part of helping to make that school as good as possible? How can I be part of helping those communities? How can I organize other parents to help advocate for the resources that all of our kids deserve? Not just how do I do a fundraiser to help my individual school, right? But how do we help all the schools? And for people who are listening that are public school workers, and again, like I said, we're NCAE is not just teachers. We're wall to wall. Anybody who works in a public school can be a member. And so for anybody who's listening that works in public schools, join your union, right? You can be part of this, you can be part of this effort right now. And for, we know a lot of folks are get hesitant about, well, I don't know if I get involved, this might happen, or this might happen, or this might happen. And they're so worried about all of the uncertainties. Well, what we know, Kai, what we know for certain, if we want certainty, is don't do anything. And what will happen is we will lose our public schools. If what you want is certainty, that should be what you do, right? The reality is headed in that direction, and the consequences are lots of uncertainty for our kids and communities. And so what I would say to anyone who's in a public school, who's been waiting to get involved, who's been waiting to join the union, act now. Right now is the time. And even if are working a second job, or have 2-3 kids that you're trying to, support as well, right? And you can't be an active member, you can't be at all the buildings, right? Pooling our resources together, right, into our union allows for more to be possible, right? So paying dues to your union, being active in your union, trying to rebuild the union in the place where you live, from your school all the way up to your whole school district, right? There's lots of things that people can do to get involved right now.
To echo a lot of things you said before with the legislative advocacy, we do a lot of trainings on those. So if anybody's listening, wants to understand how to go about that process to set up that meeting, and what the GA, and what the General Assembly looks like, and wants a tour, we do those all the time in Democracy and CISA. We would love if anybody who even wants to start that process, um, can reach out to us, and then obviously you could meet with any of your legislators, and fight for the issues that are really near and dear to you. And the fight for public education, again, is really central to the fight for democracy. Thank you so much for taking the time with us, Bryan. And I wish you and NCAE all of the best of luck this upcoming school year and this summer, as you guys continue with your bill in the legislature. And yeah, thank you so much, Bryan.
Thank you, Kai. It was a real pleasure to have the conversation.
If you are hearing this, this is the end of part 1 of this episode. Thanks for listening. If you hit the next button, you've listened to part 2 of this amazing episode.
Hit next to see if the episode is available, Thanks for listening to Built by Us.